When someone talks about being vulnerable at work, what is your reaction? Do you get excited? Or are you like the rest of us where you have this sense of impending dread and just a visceral dislike of being vulnerable at work? Because I don't know anybody who likes it or thinks it's a good idea. So why are we talking about vulnerability at work so much? Why are we asking people to be vulnerable at work? And why are we going along with it? Because let me tell you, we are getting a lot wrong when it comes to vulnerability, especially at work. So first I want to say that vulnerability itself, of course, isn't a bad thing. So as I'm saying this, I hope you're not feeling any sort of like shame or regret for having been vulnerable at work. It is not necessarily something that's wrong to do. It's that we're doing it incorrectly. And I don't think it's the fault of like normal people. I really don't. I actually think it's the fault of leadership. Leadership is making us get vulnerability wrong in two key ways, maybe even three. Let's see how far we go with this, because there's a little bit of a rabbit hole here. Personally, I never liked it. And people are asked to be vulnerable in different ways depending on your level. So if you are, kind of at that individual contributor level, you're asked to be vulnerable because people want you to open up. People want you to feel like you don't have to try and appear to be perfect. And if there's something wrong, people want you to open up and say there's something wrong. That's actually good. That's healthy. That's kind of how we should be getting vulnerable at work. But unfortunately, it's morphed just so far out of control. And when I say it's morphed out of control, like people are asking individual contributors and leaders alike to really talk about things that I don't think belong in the workplace, and asking them to get really just deeply personal where I don't necessarily think that information belongs at work, and you get to decide who you're deeply personal with. For example, if you are going through a divorce, and I say this as somebody who went through a divorce at work, it's okay to say, just so you guys know, I'm going through a divorce, I might be a little off. Fair enough, right? People should be able to take that and run with it. But what I'm seeing happen is people are being encouraged to like really talk about it and frankly pushed to overshare. And then when you don't overshare, people are like, oh, I forgot this was going on because you don't talk about it a lot. Or, oh, you're right, you did mention it once, but I didn't really think of it because blah, blah, all these reasons, because they're so used to people oversharing. So I'd say that push for vulnerability and that not accepting smaller but significant levels of vulnerability is part of the problem too, because now we've gotten to the point where we're so used to oversharing, to other people oversharing, that we kind of don't take more subtle forms of vulnerability seriously, which then makes the problem even worse, because in order to be listened to or taken seriously, then you then have to give into this culture of oversharing. And that's I'd say that's one of the more moderate impacts to this. What really makes me concerned is these other two aspects of it. I have a leader friend who I'm very, very close to, and she does not want to overshare, and she likes to have that boundary between personal and work. And for all of us, we do have that boundary, and it's okay if it's like a little further here or a little further here. Like, it needs to be whatever you're comfortable with. But I believe it should be whatever people are comfortable with. I don't believe anybody should be pushed to overshare personally at work in a way that violates where their personal definition of, that boundary lives. And my friend who's a leader feels like ever since she got into certain levels and certain roles, she feels like she's been pushed to overshare and pushed to overconnect. And so as a leader, she's in a position where she's kind of asked to guide other people through vulnerability and to model vulnerability herself. But this has gotten so out of hand for her, like she's been pushed so far that she literally clams up. Like she gets like viscerally upset whenever anybody talks about vulnerability, because in her head, and I think this is true for a lot of people associate vulnerability with oversharing, being asked to overshare themselves and being asked to accept other people's oversharing. Because when you're a leader, you have to take on all of the vulnerability of your peers, the team members that you are responsible for managing, and sometimes your own leadership. And I'm a little bit old school personally, but I don't think some old school things are necessarily wrong. And when I say that, I mean, I was raised with a leadership mentality of creating boundaries as a leader. And as a leader, I am not your therapist. I'm not your mother. And I feel like, and I'm going to say this, especially as a female leader, I am often put in a position where I feel like other people are relating to me as if I am their mom, and as if I am their therapist, as if I have to have the burden of running my department, doing my own job, managing my team, and being their therapist or mommy. So I also get a little bit like about this vulnerability thing when I'm like, hey, I don't necessarily want trauma dumping from my employees. Like, just because I'm the leader, it doesn't mean I have to carry the emotional load for everybody I encounter. But because oversharing has become so much a part of the work culture, that's almost been normalized, that leaders are supposed to accept this emotional unloading of everybody around them. And what's funny is when I work with leaders who are even older than I am or around the same age, like watching their level of discomfort because they know this has become part of the culture, it makes them so uncomfortable. So my friend and I were talking about this the other day, the one who really hates it, and every time she talked about it, she, and how much she hates, I was like, wow, we're really doing this wrong. Like, that's not what vulnerability is supposed to be at work. It's not supposed to be you being forced to confess your deepest, darkest secrets, or being forced to listen to everybody else's deepest, darkest secrets. I'm going to share another story with you. There was actually a leadership team that I heard about. I was not on this leadership team, but I heard about it, where at their leadership retreats, and I'm saying corporate leadership retreats, the executive leadership team would bring in a facilitator for the senior leaders. They were pushed to share the worst things that have ever happened to them in their life. Like, personally, the worst things, not their worst work situation. Yeah, I'm talking like childhood trauma stuff. They were pushed to confess all of this to each other in an effort to bring them closer and to force trust among leaders who might have friction. Because I will say, vulnerability, when done correctly, builds trust, right? Like, that's actually the point of vulnerability in human interactions. Well, not the only point, but it genuinely builds trust. Like, if I'm vulnerable with you, you empathize with me more, you may choose to be vulnerable in return. That's when it's a choice. That's when it's real and not forced. That's when it builds trust. So putting people in an environment where they're expected to and forced to be vulnerable in ways that they didn't choose, that doesn't actually build trust. It destroys it. Trust in the leaders above them. Then they walk around feeling like they've frankly been naked in front of their coworkers, because emotionally they have been. And it really creeped me out. And my friend had heard this story too, and it creeped her out too, because then she associates vulnerability with that level of vulnerability, which isn't a wrong association. It is an extreme example, but it really reminded me of a certain religion / cult where they force people to say the worst things they've ever done and the worst things that ever happened, and then they kind of like hold that over their heads and use that against them. Because that level of vulnerability, it isn't so that you then trust the people around you. It's that, it does feel like they have leverage over you. And that is actually what my friend ended up feeling about vulnerability. She's like, why would I tell anybody something I'm vulnerable about? They can use it against me. And I'm like, yeah, if you don't trust your coworkers and your peers, like, going to the deepest level of vulnerability is not going to build that trust. You need to build up the trust. It's like Brene Brown says with like the marbles in the jar. You actually have to build that up. You have to start with smaller trust exercises and build up to something like that. And even then, I don't think that's appropriate for work at all. I'm just going to say it, like, that is never an appropriate level of vulnerability, especially if it's forced or expected. So that story really grossed me out. And again, that's happening at the leadership level. So all of those leaders are then taking that subconsciously as a lesson in vulnerability, and they're expecting more and more exposed vulnerability from the middle management leaders underneath them, who then kind of carry that through. Now, some of this did start when some of the younger generations entered the workplace and we were all asked to be more emotionally intelligent at work, which I'm fine with. I genuinely support higher emotional intelligence, more support. I think it's great if somebody feels comfortable sharing with me that they're struggling with a mental health issue or they have to go to a therapist appointment. Very supportive of that. I do not think that's an inappropriate level of vulnerability. And I genuinely feel honored by that trust, and I try to hold that and hold space for them. But what's happened instead is people are then feeling like they're supposed to tell me why they're in therapy. That's where it crosses a line for them and for me. I don't need to know that. Unless it's something like anxiety where you need special accommodations, I'm always going to say, if you need special accommodations, make sure you're having the appropriate conversation. But I'm talking about not that. I'm talking about sharing things with me that are for your therapist, not for your boss. Because again, I don't need to carry that burden, right? Like, I'm not signed up for that, and it's not necessary. The other way leaders are modeling and getting vulnerability wrong, and this is something that as a leader with a very strong moral compass and a high conscience, this one really, really, really bothers me, what I'm about to say, which is that leaders are being artificially vulnerable to their teams. And it is so dishonest and so gross. Like, it is gross. It leaves me with the yuckiest feeling. And as I'm saying this, you may be thinking back to any sort of like town hall or meeting with senior or executive leadership. I'm talking top and second level leaders in the entire company, where they've shared something and you're like, and you just leave going like, that just felt weird, right? I watched so many leaders at that level, at this very senior leadership and executive level, saying the same vulnerable stories over and over and over again. It was rehearsed. They were carefully curated vulnerability stories, and sometimes they were used to manipulate. The reason it's so gross to me is because I hate dishonesty and artificiality. I hate it when someone's being fake vulnerable, but then they're encouraging you to be really vulnerable. That's gross, right? But on top of that, vulnerability, let me just say it again, in terms of human connection, it's supposed to build trust. It is abusive of that trust, I'm just gonna say it, to use it manipulatively. And that is what I'm seeing some leaders do. And an example is, hypothetical example, I'm just gonna say this is hypothetical, a CEO who shares a story about growing up in poverty where he hasn't been poor in over 40 years, but he's telling you the story of growing up in poverty so you feel like he relates to you when he tells you he's about to do layoffs. Like, that's disgusting. That is so manipulative. And I have seen executives doing things like that, where they are being vulnerable in order to be relatable while giving you bad news. It's bad enough if somebody's telling you something where it's not, let me just say this. If it's truly vulnerable, the speaker feels something when they say it. If it's overly rehearsed, if they've said it a million times, that emotional load is gone. That is no longer vulnerability. That's why I'm saying it's artificial. They may have felt vulnerable saying it 20 years ago, but they've said it so often, it's not truly vulnerable anymore. But they're modeling it as real vulnerability. And let me repeat, they're doing it in order to manipulate the audience. You see this in other formats too, certain talks that people give. Like I said, it just is really gross to me. It's offensive. It is deeply offensive. And let me just say, again, it really ruins what vulnerability truly is for people who are actually vulnerable. And as a leader who was rising in the ranks, I hated when I would go to leadership trainings and they would teach us how to be vulnerable. And I remember the facilitator asked us to think about the senior leadership in our company and think of times where they were vulnerable. And I'm a truth teller. We know this. And I spoke up in the class, and I think our senior leaders fake their vulnerability. And I hate it. And the facilitator was like, oh, and he knew what I was talking about, and he was like, yeah, and he's like, yeah, that's a good point. Because again, it's so rehearsed and it's so practiced, it isn't vulnerable anymore. And I also didn't like it because as a leader, I would be coached, specifically the coaching I received from multiple of my leaders, and I don't blame them as individuals. I'm saying this has become a corporate culture issue, top down from leaders above them, because they were getting the same coaching. But I would be coached, Gabby, you need to be more vulnerable in order to be relatable. And I'm like, the things that I truly feel vulnerable about, nobody has any business knowing. That's my business. And I'm not going to fake vulnerability in order to get relatability points. I'm not going to be artificial. And did that count against me sometimes? I am certain it did. Do I stand by that decision? 100%. Because I am not going to compromise myself. I am not going to leverage my own trauma for brownie points. That's not going to happen. I am also not going to pretend to be vulnerable when I'm not. I'm not going to tell the poverty story. when I know so many people had it worse than I do, when I know that so many of the people I'm speaking to are significantly less privileged right now than I am. I'm not going to sell out that way. I'm going to honor my own experiences. I'm going to honor my own boundaries, and I'm going to honor my own judgment and intuition on what it is that I share with other people. And I think more of us should hold firm to that. I think we should all feel comfortable saying, when I feel prompted to be vulnerable appropriately, I will. But I will not be pushed to be vulnerable. And when people who work for me or work with me are vulnerable with me, I will accept their vulnerability with dignity and grace. I will also make sure I'm clear about my boundaries, because we're all on different healing journeys. Nobody knows what I've dealt with. Nobody knows what anybody's dealt with. So frankly, people don't know that the thing they're oversharing with me might be deeply triggering to me. And they don't need to know that. Because me telling that to them, like if I told my story, that might be deeply triggering to them. Does that make sense? And so just remember, your leaders are human. And especially if you're dealing with managers or middle management, I'm going to say middle management is really struggling to retain their humanity when their senior leadership has often compromised their own and is trying to teach them how to do it too. So as much as we can get frustrated with senior leaders and executives, rightfully so, and middle managers can be frustrating. So I'm not saying they get a pass for things that they do that are not good, but I am saying just know that a lot of them are trying to navigate the same waters that you are. Yes, they're getting much better paid to do so. So again, I'm saying your sympathy can have its limits, but just remember they're people too. You know, like we're all just people, and people don't have a requirement to carry our burdens and our trauma. And you don't need to feel like you're expected to overshare things that you don't want to overshare. And if you're watching this and you're a leader, I hope you really think hard about how can I convey to my own team what my own personal value system around vulnerability is, that I'm not going to be dishonest about it, and I'm comfortable supporting you if you're going through life changes, but I don't need to know what those life changes involve for you. I don't need to know more than that. And just really being conscious of how you honor vulnerability with your teams, your peers, and your own leaders as well. And the reason this topic is near and dear to my heart is I always get frustrated when I see people doing something wrong. You know, I have to be honest, like that does always like push my buttons a little bit when it, you know, because deep down there's like, there's a right way to do everything. There's a right way to do vulnerability, and that is not it. But also because vulnerability is so tied to trust, the other reason I really felt compelled to speak out on this topic is because I do see it being used manipulatively. And I want everybody watching this to be very aware of how it can be misused by people around them, by leaders above them. And also those leaders are trying to teach you to do the same thing. So please be conscious of it, and please be aware so that you don't accidentally fall into that same trap of being coached into using vulnerability to manipulate other people, because that is kind of what we're being taught right now as leaders. That is part of, and they don't say that, and the people teaching it don't even think, you know, I'm going to teach you how to be manipulative, but the thing they're teaching you is manipulative. This is one of those use your powers for good situations where I want everybody watching this to leave here with an idea of what modeling vulnerability in a healthy way looks like and how to spot manipulative vulnerability. So I'm just going to recap really, really quick that vulnerability should be you saying something like, I'm having a hard time with X because Y, where Y, you know, the reason that's hard for you doesn't feel like you ripping your own guts out. Because so many people are vulnerable, and sometimes they leave a vulnerable conversation feeling like, oh, I've really unburdened myself, I feel so much better. That's good, you know what I mean? But if you leave feeling shamed or like, I wish I hadn't said that, or yeah, I never want to have a conversation like that again, that's not a good conversation. And then you know that crosses your own line of vulnerability. I'm going to share one more story. I know I'm recapping, but you know what? I'm not going to do this video perfectly, and that's going to be okay. I'm going to share one more story. I was encouraged to be more vulnerable with a senior leader about a situation than I was comfortable with. The person encouraging me to do that meant well. They very much trusted this senior leader. I did not. And I was told, please be very vulnerable with them. They need to understand you better and they will handle that information well. Let me tell you, they did not handle that information well. They did not handle the conversation well, and they walked away having made a decision about me and who I am based on a snap judgment of me during a conversation where I was being very vulnerable with them. And I was fussed at in that conversation. I was given completely inappropriate coaching for the situation, and some inappropriate things were said to me by this senior leader. And that's not why I have beef with vulnerability, but I do have beef with not listening to my gut, because I knew, I was like, I did not trust that leader, and the person who did, I knew they were wrong. But I'm also, this is where being old school is a little bit bad sometimes, I'm also very hierarchical. So if my boss tells me to do something, I'm going to do it, even against my better judgment. That has hurt me. That has cost me. As always, I'm like, don't be like me. Don't have to learn everything the hard way, so I am going to say, trust your gut. If your gut is telling you, I don't feel safe being vulnerable with this person, your gut's right. If you're just like, that's a level of vulnerability I don't want to be with anybody at work, then don't. Just, you have to honor yourself, right? And I do think that is one of the takeaways that I'd like to have from this video, is you have to honor yourself in terms of your own vulnerability and other people's. You know what you're comfortable with. Don't do anything you're not comfortable with when it comes to vulnerability. And make sure that you're encouraging other people to be very conscious of their own boundaries, because a lot of people don't necessarily actively think about this, and then they're put into a situation that they're not prepared for. They don't actively think, what is my boundary around this? And suddenly they're in rooms where they're being asked to do things and they haven't emotionally prepared themselves for that. They haven't done that work on that boundary, so they can't clearly articulate, hey, I'm okay with this and not that, because they haven't thought about it. So I just hope everybody thinks about it. And also, please, 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 this is my other takeaway, be very wary of people who are telling you a story where it sounds like they're sharing something, but there's a flip side of that where you know they want something from you. And maybe the thing they want from you is not an action. Maybe the thing they want from you is for you to be okay with an unpopular decision or with a decision you'd be unhappy about. So they're sharing this vulnerability with you to either distract you at best, or at worst, to actively emotionally manipulate you because you feel bad for them. And then you think, oh, this other thing isn't that bad, and I'm okay with these layoffs or these pay cuts, or we're not getting raises or promotions, or whatever the situation is. That is deliberately manipulative. And so I hope that everybody is aware and conscious and can watch out for that. And if you leave a conversation feeling like, they shared this with me and I just don't feel comfortable with that, or I feel kind of gross, I would encourage you to inspect that feeling and dig into that and be like, okay, what else happened in that conversation? Like, why did that happen? Because it was intentional. If a senior leader ever says something, it's intentional. It's not on accident. It's planned and rehearsed and scripted. They said it on purpose. Why did they say that? I just really want you guys to do more critical thinking about, why did they say that? Why did they tell me that thing? So I hope this helps. And if you've been feeling a type of way about vulnerability, I'd love to hear it in the comments. If you've experienced other people either pushing you to be vulnerable or using vulnerability manipulatively, I'd love to hear your stories. I think we should talk about this more, to be honest. I'm shocked that we don't talk about this more. Within the leadership community, this is almost something that we just accept, and I don't think we should. I really don't. Anyway, I'm Gabby from She Makes It Work. I hope you like my little chat about vulnerability and the mini rant that went along with it, and I'll see you guys next week.